So it's great to be here. My presentation is entitled The Stoic Heart, a micro workshop on Stoicism and relationships. And I'm delighted to be able to share in the Zoom and the conversation. This is indeed a micro workshop, so there'll be pauses for reflection, there's some polls, there's even some writing prompts, and I encourage everyone to participate at whatever pace or to what degree is most comfortable for them. I'm Andi Sciacca, that's me on the left, and thank you, Massimo, for the wonderful introduction. I came to Stoicism as a study and practice about 7 years ago when I participated in Stoic Week with my husband and business partner, Greg Sadler, and that's him on the right. Greg is probably known to some of you as the editor of Stoicism Today, and he is a public philosopher. And what we discovered, I think in rich ways, was that Stoic practice actually improved our relationship. It improved our working relationship, our marriage, the relationships that we had with others, whether that was with family or with the communities to which we belonged, or coworkers or friends. And so we've done various versions of the Stoic Heart as workshops, as panel conversations. Greg presented one of the sort of offshoots or iterations of this workshop in London. We have found that it's very useful to our practice as human beings. And I agree with what Massimo was saying. There's such a lovely, really rich hunger, I think, for application of Stoic principles and practices. And to Tim's point, and we'll talk a little bit about this today, the sort of uncertain circumstances around issues of pandemic or social inequity or food supply issues, as you know, the introduction mentioned, I'm very deeply involved with the food system work. We see that there are great applications for conversations around those topic areas and the relationships that connect to basically daily life. So this really is a virtual experience, kind of pandemic inspired micro workshop. What that means is that ordinarily with some of the prompts, we may break out into groups if we were meeting in person. I'm hoping that you will take the opportunity to use some of these reflective prompts and even writing prompts and engage with others after this presentation, whether it be as a conversational catalyst or something that you reflect on in a journal, something that maybe you share conversation around your dinner table. But I do think that some of the quotes and reflections that we'll be looking at today as applied to Stoicism and relationships could be helpful to you. If you would like a copy of the slides or a sort of little workbook that I put together, you can access it at this link. That will also be made available to you after the talk, but there are just some handouts and things that you might find useful should you decide to actually practice this with a partnership or a group or another relationship in which you're involved, as a way of getting to know a little bit more about how to apply Stoic practices and principles. In part, because this is really the premise of the workshop today, when you live in accordance with nature during ordinary times, you have the tools you need to live in accordance with nature during extraordinary times. We are indeed in extraordinary times. And I have found personally that I've been able to navigate some difficult decisions, maintain calm in areas where I otherwise might not have, and actually engage in conversations that involve a certain degree of conflict around attitudes toward things like social distancing or political culture or social justice by engaging some of these same tools. So if I could ask for Phil to post poll question number 1, we're just going to take a little bit of a baseline of our group today. The question is, how often do you engage Stoic principles or practices in your personal relationships under ordinary circumstances? And there's 4 choices there. The first, not at all. I'm here to learn about Stoicism. The second, sometimes. I'm learning, but not always consistent. The third, often. I'm working consistently on living a life in accordance with nature. And the fourth, consistently, if not daily, Stoic principles and practices guide my way. So, Phil, I'm not sure where we are with numbers.
We've got about 500 of the audience has already answered, and we're 37 seconds in. So let's give them 45 seconds, and then I'll send it back to you, okay?
That sounds great. Thank you.
And there we are. And okay, pop and share the results. It's all yours.
Okay. So we see that 9% are here because they're new. Welcome. I think that's great. 47%, our largest percentage, sometimes. I'm learning, but not always consistent. I would say that I actually fall in that category myself. I try to be consistent. I work hard at this. This has become a part of my daily practice. But like many people, I'm thrown off balance from time to time, and do find that referring back to the Stoic principles and practices and trying to live in accordance with virtue is something that's helpful to me. Our third category, close behind, is often. I'm working consistently on living a life in accordance with nature. And then 14% of you are doing this consistently, if not daily. So that's an interesting sort of baseline. Now, the next question is actually going to twist that just a little bit. So for poll question 2, same general idea, however, connected directly to the pandemic. So how often have you engaged Stoic principles or practices in your personal relationships during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic? Option 1, not at all. I'm definitely not quarantining in accordance with nature. 2, sometimes I'm trying, but masked up living can get the better of me. 3rd, often I'm working consistently on living a life in accordance with nature. And 4th, consistently, if not daily, Stoic principles and practices provide me with a useful framework for navigating this or any other difficult situation.
All right, so we're at 500. We got 5 more seconds, folks. 3, 2, 1, and pop. And I'm going to share those results. There you go.
Okay, well, this is an interesting connection, and I think it goes well with what Tim was saying about the sort of hunger for tools in order to navigate what we're seeing as difficulty through this pandemic. We're now in my area in 7 months since the first quarantine. I am speaking to you today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we are sort of on the map for both out of control COVID numbers and a lot of unrest from social and racial justice issues. So it is encouraging to me to see that there are 41% of you that feel that you are tapping into the practices and principles of Stoicism in a meaningful way to help you navigate the various concurrent factors that have been creating stress during the COVID-19 pandemic. So 4% of you are struggling. I hope that participating in Stoicon today and hopefully engaging in some of the reflective writings that we'll do in this workshop are helpful to you. 36% trying. Masked up living can get the better of us all. I think in some working relationships, I serve on a number of different boards, and in one we are actively engaged in sort of community service projects, and some very normally level-headed people were just expressing great frustration over the fact that they couldn't get out into the community and connect with people, even though it was very clearly not the safe way to actually live up to the mission. I think we see a lot of examples of that happening in other cases. And then 18% consistently really using this as a positive and useful framework, which is fantastic. So thank you, Phil. Now, I'm going to reflect on a few different passages from, I think, names that are most likely familiar to you. And we will talk a little bit about that, and then there will be some writing prompts that follow. And you'll notice that there's 2 little birds on the slides where I'm including a quote. That's not a purely aesthetic design. That's intended to sort of remind you, if you're referencing this afterward, that these passages and prompts are great when used in conversation with others. So if you're feeling stress, these can be positive passages that you can sit down with your partner or your child or your coworker or someone in your community and actually talk through and hopefully gain some insight and value from. So this is one of my favorite passages from Epictetus. It's one that I reference often. I'll, in full disclosure, confess to being very controlling in all aspects of my life. So I like to determine my own path. I like to determine my own career path. I often am the first one to speak and the last one to stop speaking. And so this passage has actually helped me more than anything in my personal life. And that is, remember that you are an actor in a drama of such a kind as the author pleases to make it. And I cut out a piece, but this second part is really significant for me as well. For this is your business, to act well the character assigned to you, to choose it is another's. And I think that if any of you are struggling with feelings of control or a desire to take control, this can be a very positive passage to reflect upon, because it doesn't mean that you surrender all agency for all choices in your life. It means that at times you may need to be in one role and at other times in another role in order to sort of serve the good. So as we look at the types of relationships that we're going to explore today, I've chosen to use hands as a means of connecting and communicating. And we're going to talk a little bit about interpersonal relationships with partners and intimate associations. We're going to talk about family, about friends, about coworkers, and those that are in our communities. So before we jump into that, I'm going to give everyone just a moment to write. You can use a digital notebook. You can use whatever you want. Like I said, the bit.ly link at the top of the presentation had a little workbook for you to do. If you'd like to just observe now and go through this later, please feel welcome. But writing prompt number 1 is to take a moment to write down just a few words and or your initial thoughts about the roles you're being called to play in each of the relationship categories we are considering today. As I said, we'll reference these roles throughout today's workshop. But just like with the baseline poll, it can be useful to just have a few words in mind. You may find as you're writing, and please feel free to start writing now. I'm just going to do a little bit of light conversation while you're doing that. But you may find that there's conflict in one of those categories that isn't ordinarily there, or perhaps there's pains of the body. Because of the pandemic, family relationships where caretaking is involved have radically changed. It might be your need to care for a family member who's ill, but the normal channels for doing that don't exist. It could be that you're a restaurant owner and you're seeing the entire industry essentially decimated. 85% of restaurants will not reopen. And that was, I think, the statistic in August. It could be more devastating than that. So not to focus on the negative, there may be things where, you know, the time in quarantine brought you greater joy. Perhaps it allowed you to slow down. Perhaps it allowed you to take a little bit more time to play board games or read with your partner or cook together. In work, it could be a challenge. Now that we're all on Zoom, I think there's this expectation that everyone is available all the time, because where else would you be? So it could be more demands. You feel that, you know, you're constantly being pressured to be on a screen someplace. As you write those down, we're going to sort of close and move on to the next conversation. Take a moment now and really think about what you put in the category of your intimate relationships. And as you're sort of reflecting on that, think about ways in which you might utilize Stoic practices and principles to create a greater sense of trust or communication or openness. Calling on Tim's presentation, maybe this is a time to really focus in on the zest, the excitement, the energy. Are there ways in which you can, through Stoic practice and asking yourself questions about how you're working to perhaps manage your expectations? I think that's probably the key thing that I have used Stoic practices and principles to help me with, that, and of course, surrendering control. But are there ways in which you can find meaning in this space and in this time that will help you with that? And thinking next then of family. We've talked a little bit already about how relationships can be challenged during times of stress. But when you think of your family dynamic, it may be that your role has to change. Perhaps you're a child, an adult child of a parent who's ill, and that changes and shifts over time. Perhaps you have children who are teenagers and they're going through their own processes. Maybe you have a kid who's at a college away and there's a COVID outbreak. How are you managing that? But even taking this pandemic frame away, I think family is one of the areas in which we see the greatest amount of role shifting, in part because families evolve over time and there's parents and children. I grew up in an intergenerational family, so my grandparents lived with us. I know that I gained specific value in that process, and I learned how to tap into the wisdom of others, or perhaps have more compassion as a result of seeing my grandparents age as I was growing up and becoming more healthy and stronger. In terms of family, in terms of friends, we can see a lot of shifting in our social circles based on response to some of the things that are occurring right now in COVID. And that can be connected to various decisions or positions on politics, on social distancing, on engagement. I have a good friend who is immunocompromised and she's not able to connect with anyone. And I have another friend who's, as soon as the bars opened here in Milwaukee, she was right there, mask off, hugging friends, talking about how great it was to be together. My judgment of their actions doesn't have to strip away compassion for where those decisions or actions are coming from. The same with work. We talked a little bit about that. The demands of the sort of never-ending workday, the always-on philosophy of kind of, engaging with others. And for those of us who are working in knowledge workspaces or already working online, it's not that great a shift necessarily, but for some, there is no online option. How are we taxing the workforce that's, say, delivering groceries or, working in some of those essential areas? And the same with community, whether it's a self-assembled community, you're on a board, you're part of a team, whatever the case may be, there's a lot of opportunity there for connecting, for growing, and for applying Stoic principles and practices to strengthening those relationships. So we have 3 more polls and a couple more writing prompts, and I know we're flying through the time here. So I'm going to ask Phil if he would bring up poll 3. And this connects to something I think Tim was talking about in the last presentation. Have you noticed a change in the ways in which the pandemic has required you to adapt to the kinds of roles you are called to play in your relationships? Option 1, not at all. I'm relatively unaffected by the pandemic in my daily life. 2, sometimes. There are times when I need to adapt my role, but not often. 3, often. I'm addressing numerous role changes during the pandemic. And 4, consistently, if not daily, the pandemic has required a significant shift for me. And Phil, I think once we get to a decent number, a quorum, we can just.
All right, we're going to call this one here on 3, 2, 1. Pop and share it.
Okay, so sometimes, and that would make sense, right? In a sort of inconsistent shifting landscape, it could be expected that we would see that there are times where roles need to change, but not that often. Very interesting. Okay, let's go right into poll number 4.
The next poll, right?
Yes, please. Thank you. So have you experienced stress due to the ways in which the pandemic has required you to adapt to the kinds of roles you are called to play in your relationships? Not at all. I'm relatively unaffected. Sometimes there are times when I have some stress because I need to adapt my role, but not often. Often I'm addressing numerous role changes during the pandemic and find them quite unsettling, even when trying to apply Stoic principles and practices. And 4th, consistently, if not daily, the pandemic has required a significant shift for me, and that shift is creating significant stress.
All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, pop, and let's share that.
Okay, interesting. So we may expect after that earlier poll response that sometimes is again the leading category there. I think it's interesting though to see the very small number on significant shift. I would have actually expected something a little bit higher than that, but it's encouraging. And I think what's great is that if we look at the categories people are choosing, we're seeing that folks are indeed using Stoic principles and practices to help them through. So now let's go into our final poll, and that's poll 5. And this is a question about, again, reflecting back on the categories we addressed. So in which of the categories that we reviewed have you had to adapt most to the kinds of roles you are called to play in your relationships? Romantic and intimate partnerships, immediate and extended family, friends and close acquaintances, colleagues and professional relationships, or immediate and extended community?
All right. It's give them a few seconds here. They're voting. All right, we've got 400 in here. So I'm going to call it 3, 2, 1, and there you go. And
okay, immediate and extended family is the lead, right? Shortly behind that, colleagues and professional relationships. Behind that, romantic and intimate partnerships. And then immediate and extended community. So let's take a look at some ways in which we can engage some of those categories, and we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you, Phil. As we discussed a little bit earlier, there's a lot going on. One of my roles, as was mentioned in the intro, is to support and guide the entire graduate curriculum for the Culinary Institute of America with campuses in New York, Singapore, Texas, and California. And at 4 different points this year, there's been massive evacuations. My program is wholly online, but the fires have been very impactful to people in that area. We know that climate change and climate issues and issues of disaster, hurricanes, fires, those can be very unsettling things. And we're right in that season where these are at their peak. We're also very close to an election here in the United States. I know we have viewers from all over the world, but I also know that given the sort of friction that's occurring in the American political system, global citizens are looking at what that election will yield. The economy is in dire straits. There's a lot of focus on issues of police, justice, access, and then of course the pandemic. So how do we really kind of take a step back and address those stressors? I'm going to point us to another passage, this one from Epictetus again. You must behave in life as at a dinner party. Is anything brought to you? Put out your hand and take your share with moderation. Does it pass by you? Don't stop it. Is it not yet come? Don't stretch your desire towards it, but wait till it reaches you. So this is a passage I find useful in part because I struggle with this. I think for all of the passages I'm going to share with you today, there are areas where I have found the opportunity for growth personally because they are issues that I tend to find deserve a high priority if my desire is to truly access the virtues and live a good life. So when you think about what's coming your way, it can be very difficult, especially if you desire control, especially if you're frustrated or feeling those stressors, to feel connected during these times. If we think of the dinner party analogy, let's then go then to another writing prompt. And this writing prompt 2, what kinds of concurrent stressors are creating the greatest challenge for you in your relationships at this time? So what sort of dishes are you being served at this dinner party table in your life right now? And the second part of that, how might you better understand those stressors through a decision to focus only on what lies within your control? So this is something that you may jot some notes on. Again, I don't expect anyone's going to be able to do a fully sort of articulated prompt with the limited time that we have, but I have found that this prompt is helpful to create meaningful conversations, especially in areas where you're not in an intimate or familial partnership. This can be a great prompt for navigating stressors with colleagues, with friends, and with maybe community organizations. So now I'm going to focus a little bit on another passage from Seneca. And I have this on 2 separate slides. I wanted to make it readable. But it's about this idea of true happiness, right? True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future. It's not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears, but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient. For he that is so wants nothing. The greatest blessings of mankind are within us and within our reach. A wise man is content with his lot, whatever it may be, without wishing for what he has not. This is a conversation that I've seen a lot
Andi,
of folks.
3 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Who are focused on justice, grappling with, in part because we do desire to create justice, and contentment in times of necessary change can be difficult. So again, I would just encourage you to take a look at some of these passages. This time to write, we will save. Again, it's in the slide deck. This is something that you can do on your own time. But the question then would be, how can we create and practice contentment in our relationships with others? How can we prioritize the virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom in the present, especially when the present is disagreeable to us? And of course, what presentation would be complete without Marcus Aurelius? Your ability to control your thoughts, treat it with respect. It's all that protects your mind from false perceptions, false to your nature, and that of all rational beings. It's what makes thoughtfulness possible, an affection for other people, and submission to the divine. So again, this is a writing prompt that we'll save for you to do on your own time. However, I think it's incredibly powerful, especially if you're trying to navigate conflict and or repair a breach of trust or some sort of disagreement. And it's to think of a recent disagreement you've had that's caused you pain or is perhaps even now unresolved. It could be an argument with a partner, family member, a friend, a colleague, or a member of the community. And with this disagreement in mind, write down 3 ways in which your argument or position was false and how you might engage thoughtfulness instead. I think if you just start with that one small act, you can find that it's easier to sort of approach a desire of connection and repair. So I'm almost at the very end. I want to just focus on sort of a longer quote from Marcus Aurelius again that I find great comfort in. Keep reminding yourself of the way things are connected, of their relatedness. All things are implicated in one another and in sympathy with one another. This event is the consequence of some other one. Things push and pull on each other and breathe together and are one. The things ordained for you, teach yourself to be at one with those, and the people who share them with you, treat them with love, with real love. That, to my mind, is how you really strengthen your Stoic heart. As Tim said, Stoic Week is starting. I can't recommend enough that you participate. I will be with Greg at Stoicon X Midwest, also a virtual event, and participating in a Stoic salon on journaling in November 4th. I'd love to hear from any of you. It's been a delight sharing what I hope are some useful passages and reflections, and enjoy Stoicon.